Hi, everyone, and happy Wednesday. I am Amy Hajari Case, and this is our Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Disease Education webinar series. Welcome. We are here to talk about a really important topic today. We'll be talking about the role of the National Institutes of Health in finding new treatments for pulmonary fibrosis. And I feel like this is a very timely topic for our community and our country at large. I have invited, and I'm just really delighted to have with me today Dr. Sonye Danoff. She is a member of the PFF's medical team and has been since 2000. She is a professor in the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care Medicine, co-director of the ILD clinic at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and she specializes in pulmonary fibrosis, specifically those associated with autoimmune disease, including myositis. And she's been in a number of national collaborative groups that are studying interstitial lung disease. Before we get started, I do have a couple of housekeeping notes very quickly, particularly those who are new to the Zoom platform. And those of you who have been with us before will bear with me. If you need to get in touch with us about a technical question or concern, you can go to the Q&A tab on your toolbar, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Go there, type us a question. Somebody from our team will try to answer that and help you troubleshoot if possible. Additionally, we will take questions at the end of this session, and so please drop those there as well. We'll get to as many of them as we can. You do have an option on your toolbar for closed captioning. It's pretty accurate, so if you want to have that there, you can. And then also we have, I believe, will be, oh, sorry. Can you guys see my screen now? Sonia, are you seeing? Okay. We'll fix that later. I have lost my train of thought. Oh, we will have these slides available for download for you. Those should be in the chat at some point during this session. And please stay with us at the end for a questionnaire there. I think you're actually seeing, hopefully not my chat anymore. The information we have today is educational as usual. And because we have a lot to talk about, I'm not going to delay any further. Dr. Danoff, thank you so much for being here. And let's get started.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I think that this is a topic that's actually relevant to all of us. And so what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what is this entity that we call the NIH. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the NIH, what we're talking about is this organization called the National Institutes of Health. And I thought it would be interesting just to give a little bit of historical perspective. So next click, please. So it turns out that the NIH is almost 100 years old. It was designated by Congress in 1930. Next click, please. And the mission of the NIH is to develop knowledge about living things and use that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. So the NIH's mantra is essentially turning discovery into health. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because there are a lot of ways that we learn how to take better care of our patients. And so as a result, the NIH actually supports multiple missions. The first is what we might call basic research. This is the kind of research that someone might do working in a lab using cells or tissues and trying to understand why fibrosis could occur in lung cells. And these findings are really important because they help us identify the sorts of changes that lead to fibrosis and allow us to think about how best to prevent that from happening or treat it once it does happen. Then we have what's called translational research, and that's essentially taking things which are ideas that have been learned at the bench, perhaps on these cells or tissues, and then trying to take that and translate it into something which is more directly applicable to human health. So maybe taking an observation and saying, gee, this seems like it would be an important pathway to understand. We could use this to understand if it means that a person's pulmonary fibrosis is going to be active or if it's under pretty good control. We would call that a biomarker. Then there's clinical research, which really is aimed at developing approaches to prevent, treat, and cure disease. And obviously, that is a key mission for all of us at the PFF, is to find approaches to prevent, treat, and cure pulmonary fibrosis in all its forms. And then there are several other missions of the NIH, which are very important. The first of which is that it wants to bring everybody into research. So it doesn't matter if you live in a rural community or an urban community. It doesn't matter what your background is. Everybody should have access to research, both participating in it and doing research. And then the second thing is that there are many diseases and many needs across all of the United States. And the goal is to make sure that there are opportunities for people with many different diseases to have that access. Next slide, please. So, and again, I just want to point out that these are directly from the NIH website, and I would encourage everybody who hasn't had a chance to look through their website to do so. It's actually written to a large extent for all people, for the general public, not just for researchers. But really, what the NIH is trying to focus on is the idea that when you start out with really basic questions like what makes a lung cell damaged or what makes scarring happen, you can then go towards a more patient-centered approach, which is how do we take that information and transport it into the actual care of our patients? And these are some of the areas that are focuses for the NIH currently. You can see the list here, but I think that one of the ones that's very important for us is both healthy living. How do you live your life so that your likelihood of progressing in pulmonary fibrosis is lower? And also precision medicine, which is that each person is very different. So how do we use information from a single individual to know what is going to be the best care for that individual person? And I think that the fact that these are the sort of core missions of the NIH really speaks to why it is so relevant for patients who have pulmonary fibrosis and interstitial lung disease. Next slide, please. I did really just want to go back to this idea that the mission of the NIH is to take knowledge and apply it so that it improves health, lengthens life, and reduces illness and disability. And all of those are very fundamental for us in this ILD space. And so you can see that one of the ways that the NIH does this is that programs are designed to focus on very specific things like what is the cause, diagnosis, prevention, and cure of human disease. And in this situation, you would put in the word pulmonary fibrosis or interstitial lung disease. And many of the things that we talk about, like what are the impacts of things in our environment? Are there specific exposures that might make it more likely for you to develop pulmonary fibrosis? And on the other side, are there things that are in our environment that might make you less likely to develop pulmonary fibrosis? And so all of these approaches of the NIH are really designed to take very fundamental knowledge and turn it into something that will actually impact human health. Next slide, please. So how does the NIH actually do this? I've told you what the mission is, but how do they actually do this? Well, it turns out that the NIH actually provides funding for research. So it has a portion of that research that takes place on the campus in Bethesda, and there's also a second campus in North Carolina. And about 10% of the NIH's funds go to scientists who actually work at the NIH. And that includes in our area are people who work in the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood. And that is one which focuses on a mission of lung disease and specifically has a subset that works on pulmonary fibrosis. It also funds the National Human Genome Research Institute, which helps us understand what are the genetic risk factors that might impact a person's risk of developing pulmonary fibrosis. So many of the institutes actually focus on topics that are very relevant to our disease space. Now, that's 10% of their funding. That's a small amount. Actually, 80% of their funding goes out to researchers in the community. So many of you may have been seen at a Care Center Network site. Many of our Care Center Network sites are actually recipient of NIH grants. That is, that a person might write a grant that says, I think that I have a really good idea about one of the risk factors for pulmonary fibrosis, and I'm going to write a very detailed explanation of how I'm going to study that. And it gets reviewed by a bunch of other experts not involved with the research. And they say either, yes, we think this is likely to move the field forward, or we think you should change X, Y, and Z to make it a better proposal. And then that proposal gets funding from the NIH. And it's really important. You're going to see from Dr. Case's slide later how much of the research that we do in the pulmonary fibrosis space actually derives from the NIH. So it is the major funder of all research which is relevant to pulmonary fibrosis. And the way it is distributed, as I said, is people put in a proposal. Sometimes they respond to what is called a request for applications. Maybe the NHLBI says, we think it is really important to understand how is it better to deliver oxygen to our patients. And they will put out a request for application, and then individuals can send in an application and says, here's how we're going to look at this question. And if it is judged to be very scientifically sound and important and going to give important information, then that group would end up with funding. The funding goes to the place where the person works. So I work at Johns Hopkins. And so when I write a grant, if my grant is funded, it goes to Johns Hopkins. And then Johns Hopkins gives me that money to pay for the people who do the research, to pay for the materials that I need to do the research. If I'm doing a clinical trial with funding from the NIH, I might also send some of that funding to other institutions where they're going to be helping to recruit patients for it and be part of the study. So this has a very significant impact because it provides research funding, not just for a few individuals at the NIH, but for many individuals across the United States. Next slide, please. So this is just to kind of give you a sense. I think I've kind of alluded to this. So 14 of the 27 institutes at the NIH have been funding PF-related research grants. And this is data from 2023, which was our most recent full data. But most of it comes from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which funded 203 grants. So this is probably the most significant financial input to making progress in the field of pulmonary fibrosis. Next slide, please. So I talked to you a little bit about the fact that people put in these applications and then it is reviewed by a group of experts. And what you can see is that there are different levels of grants. So a K award on the right side of your screen is something that is given to somebody who is a trainee. Maybe it's somebody who's has finished their training and they're just new on a faculty. And this is what's called a mentored grant. And that's very important because that helps us build the experts who will be the pipeline for care for pulmonary fibrosis patients and their families for the next decade or several decades. Then there are the grants that are on the right, which are called R01s. Those are independent investigators. That might be for somebody who has already gotten a K award and is continuing their research. And they finished their mentored period. They now are an independent researcher. They've got a really good idea. They have an approach that they want to use to understand more about pulmonary fibrosis. Now, one of the things that you will see here, though, is that amongst all applicants, only a small percentage actually get funded, so that when we think about these grants, what we're really talking about is a very highly competitive environment to have the absolutely best grants funded. And those grants are very carefully screened by many people in the field to try to select the ones that have the greatest likelihood of having benefit and fitting in with this mission of taking basic knowledge and then applying it to improve health. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Case now, and she's really going to focus even more on how the NIH interfaces with the research that moves the field of pulmonary fibrosis forward.
Thanks, Dr. Danoff. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to get a little bit more specific about the role of the NIH to our community. And before I go into that, I'm just going to give you a quick reminder of what Dr. Danoff alluded to earlier. Those are what types of medical and health research are out there. We actually end up talking the most about clinical trials as it pertains to pulmonary fibrosis. Those are really the last step in new therapeutic development. And clinical studies are kind of the most common things that our community members can actually participate in. But basic science research is really the cornerstone of discovery. The study of normal processes, how the body, like how disease happens. And if you don't know what's going wrong, you can't figure out how to target it later. So without that basic science, that preclinical step in research, new drugs, new therapies, new approaches can't be developed. And you may have seen something like this before. We've shown something similar in previous webinars, but just to give you an idea of how an idea becomes a clinically available therapy, this is the drug development kind of pipeline. And this is not specific to pulmonary fibrosis. It just gives you an idea of, before we get to in-human studies, there are so many ideas that have to be evaluated, so many approaches that are investigated, compounds, molecules that are then tested before they get to humans. So either in animal models or in tissue, and then only those that seem like they may go on and have rationale for use in people can move on to clinical trials. And so what we really need are these thousands or more shots on goal to get something that eventually becomes an approved new therapy for an indication. And this happens over several years, if not longer, and just to be frank, costs quite a lot of money from beginning to end. This is the part you may not fully appreciate, and I want to take a minute to try to help you with that. We talk a lot about those clinical trials. Most of our clinical trials for pulmonary fibrosis are sponsored by industry, by pharmaceutical companies that are taking those drugs through the human development of them. And then if successful, we'll then market them. And we have seen over the years that a lot of our clinical trials have not made it past phase 2. We've had some high profile, unfortunately, phase 3 drugs that were not beneficial and have not turned into new therapies. And so it is some risk that they take on to do that, and it is a cost that they take on to do that. But most of those clinical trials are not sponsored by the federal government. Now, the NIH, and in the case of pulmonary fibrosis, the NHLBI that we spoke about, are most involved in the funding of preclinical work, so basic science, although they do fund some clinical trial work as well. And that's where the thousands of shots on goal happen. And then once we get success in that is where the clinical trial involvement and most often the industry research will pick up. And to let you know, NIH-funded research contributed to the development of every single new approved therapy in the United States, not just for pulmonary fibrosis, in the United States between 2010 and 2016. And that's around 40 to 50 drugs every year in those years. Now, so this is a lot of investment and a lot of to get a lot of benefit. Now you might think to yourself, well, the PFF funds research, right? So let's talk about that and the magnitude of that. We do fund research. And one of the ways we do that is through our PFF Scholars Program, which, like the NIH grants, requires an application and a committee review, and really only the best of the best proposals are funded. And these are early investigator, oftentimes early ahead of the K awards that the NIH provides, but they are mentored. These are early career investigators, sometimes fellows, sometimes junior faculty, and this shows you, we feel like this is a great place for the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation to have a big impact on somebody in their early career that then can go on to grow, stay in the space, continue to do pulmonary fibrosis research, and grow into an independent investigator, a clinician, however their career goes. But when you compare that amount that we feel is highly impactful, really important, to what the National Institutes of Health is able to do for pulmonary fibrosis research annually, it is staggering how much difference there is, right? So the impact of those $120 million a year that the NIH puts towards pulmonary fibrosis research is just so critically important. And that is a small slice of the annual budget for the total NIH. So we are we advocate for our slice of the pie, which is important and field changing, but it is still the entire budget of the NIH is much bigger than this. And I've also compared here some of the other like organizations that do fund research in pulmonary fibrosis and their impact as well. So there's really not a place for these nonprofit organizations to kind of pick up all the slack if the NIH were not able to do what they do now. I mentioned that the NIH does fund clinical research in addition to early phase research in basic science. And some of these you may recognize. I'm actually, in the interest of time, not going to go into a lot of detail about these, but these were very important clinical trials for pulmonary fibrosis. The IPF NET was a group consortium of sorts that did run several clinical trials collaboratively funded by the NIH, including the Panther study of prednisone, azathioprine, and N-acetylcysteine, which, if you've heard me talk about before, did make a big change in practice, because this is a drug combination that prior to this study was thought to potentially have benefit for patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. This study determined that it actually didn't. It was not a study that was going to get done by any other entity than the National Institutes of Health. You also see a trial of warfarin here, the cleanup IPF study that looked at antibiotic therapy to try to make changes to the microbiome, and then the precision study, which we also talk about as being a really important next step in therapeutic development for pulmonary fibrosis, because it is the first study to recruit based on specific genetic combinations in pulmonary fibrosis. One thing I'll call out about these studies is that they are all using old generic therapies, not novel new therapies that have never been used in humans before. And so if you think about it, if warfarin had been helpful, which it was not, just to be clear, or Coumadin, you may have heard that name of it, there's not a lot of financial upside in that development. And so there may not be a lot of incentive for another group to come in and try to test that. And so this is where some of these NIH-funded clinical trials can be helpful in, particularly in repurposed therapies and generic therapies that have rationale and need to be tested. The other thing I'll tell you is that the data collected in these studies has been incredibly helpful and used to understand more about disease process as well. So it's not that the data is being collected just to understand whether a drug works, but it is also being used and analyzed and to understand, again, disease process, develop biomarkers, and understand progress and so on. I'm actually going to pause here and take my slides down and invite Dr. Danoff to come back on the screen for just a minute before we go on. The reason I'm going to do this is a little bit different than how we usually go with our webinars, but I want to have a conversation with Dr. Danoff in front of all of you about her experience as an NIH-funded researcher. This is not an experience that I have personally, and so I'm going to learn a little bit more as we talk. Dr. Danoff, start a little bit with the process that led up to your application, to your grant application for pick a funding, pick a time, right? That what you had to actually do before you could even put in an application.
Well, thank you, Dr. Case. So I have been involved in applications for myself as well as many of my trainees. And so what I would say is that this is actually an incredibly intensive process where not only do you have to have a good hypothesis, that is, this is what I think we're going to find, but you have to have a very rigorous way to test that hypothesis because really the goal of all NIH funding is to have meaningful information come from the questions that are being asked. So first, you do a lot of background research because nobody really gets a grant without having some background research done. And maybe you do that working in the lab of a mentor, so somebody who trains you. Then you generate your preliminary data, you come up with your ideas of where that data should take you, and then you write a proposal. And I can tell you that for our trainees and colleagues at Johns Hopkins, we have a very strong internal program where many senior faculty members review all of the grants that are going to be submitted because we want people to provide the best science possible. So if we see that there are potential ways to make a grant application better, we want to suggest that before it even gets into review at the NIH. And then at the NIH, a whole panel, maybe 10 or 15 additional experts are going to review the grants again and say, not only is this well done, but is this the best? Because only a small percentage of those grants will be funded. And as I mentioned, the types of grants that the NIH gives are some of them are what we call mentored, which is where somebody is just beginning in the field and needs to have sort of a senior person to help them develop their ideas, maybe use their resources and so forth to get to being independent. And then we have the independent grants, which are the R01s. I didn't really talk about the fact that there's also some small business grants that allow companies to develop products that will have an impact in the healthcare space. And that's also been very important for us in the pulmonary fibrosis field. So it's really a very long process. And from turning in a grant to getting actually the reviews can take over a year. And then if the review doesn't say, gee, you're going to get funded this time, then you can reapply, but it might take you another year for the reapplication to go in. So it's both a very intensive process and it's also a very highly developed process to make sure that the very best grants get funded.
Let me ask you this question. So, if you are in a position of having a mentored grant, the K award, and maybe that independent grant is the answer is do a little bit more work, not yet. What happens to that investigator? Like, what do they do, right? Because I'm do they stay with their mentor? Do they move on and do something else? What happens to them?
That's that's a really challenging question, and it is very kind of context dependent. So unfortunately, some of our really talented young investigators have to find something else to do because the ability to do research really depends on having this kind of funding in order to kind of move research forward. There's certainly other sources. And I mean, you've pointed out the fact that the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation provides very important seed research funding, especially for new career investigators, for new investigators. But without the kind of grants that the NIH gives, it's very hard to continue. And so we do have what we would call a leaky pipeline, which is that we've got a lot of really bright young people who are not able to go on just because there isn't enough funding for everybody. And sadly, we also are in a situation where even if you do get that original K, that mentored grant, you might not be able to get an R01, which is that independent investigator. And so all along the line, it's almost like the diagram that you showed for drug development. It might not be 5,000 to 1, but it's certainly, many hundred to 1 in terms of the leaky pipeline of people who have really good ideas but are not able to continue on to develop those ideas as say senior researchers.
I'm going to change a little bit here and ask you, okay, so now you have funding from the NIH for a project. What sorts of things does that pay for? What do
Yeah.
you do with those dollars?
Right, absolutely. That's a really important question. I know that this has been in the news a lot lately. So the grant itself pays for things like having somebody who is working in the lab. So maybe a research technician, or maybe it's helping to pay for a postdoctoral fellow. So one of those people in training who is going to go on to be a scientist independently. It also is paying for all of the reagents that are used. So if you're doing cell-based work, it might be paying for all of the materials that you need to work on cells. If you are doing a clinical trial, it's paying for all the resources needed to recruit patients, to have, patients get a drug or an intervention that is being studied. And then it's also paying salaries. I mean, it's paying the salaries of the people who are doing the work. We sometimes talk about, there's been a bit in the news about this idea of indirect costs. So the direct costs are paying those things. And then there's something called an indirect cost. And that's actually negotiated between the NIH and the institution. So every institution, whether it's Johns Hopkins or University of Maryland or any of the places that receives them, has a negotiated rate. And what that rate is how much does it actually cost to keep the lights on in the building, keep the heat on, keep water running, keep the electricity running, so that I, as a researcher, can do my experiment? Because my research funds pay for the cells that are in the incubator, but they don't pay for the electricity and the gas and all of the other upkeep that is necessary in order to run an experiment. And that's what indirect costs do, is they pay for the infrastructure that allows research to take place.
That's a great answer. Thank you. All right, now I'm going to ask you, you're not supposed to pick among your favorite children, but do you have one funded project that you can share with our audience today about and talk with them about how it has impact on the PF community and potentially them specifically?
Absolutely. So it's, yeah, as you say, it's hard to pick amongst the children, but I want to talk about actually two of my trainees who have received K awards. And one of my trainees has been very interested in a type of interstitial lung disease that affects people who have an autoimmune disease called autoimmune myositis. And what she observed as she was training is that there were different risk factors. And some of those risk factors seem to be related to people's genetic background. And so she made a proposal to look at how those genetic backgrounds might influence both the kind of disease a person has, the severity of the disease, the likelihood that they might die from that disease. And that's been an incredibly important set of research that is really helping us move forward in trying to understand what is the relationship between your genetic background and your likelihood of getting this form of interstitial lung disease. And she has recently been awarded an R01, which will allow her to take that research and go further with it. We continue to collaborate because these are really important studies that need to have multiple groups work together to make them meaningful. So I think that that's one really wonderful example. I'm going to give one other example, which is there is a form of interstitial lung disease that happens when some people get treated for cancer. And the treatment is something called an immune checkpoint inhibitor. And if you watch the news or anything else, it's always in the advertisements. It's this new kind of treatment for cancer where the immune system itself is used in order to kill the cancer. And it's been just life-changing for people with many forms of lung cancer, melanoma, various types. But unfortunately, in a small fraction of people who get that, they actually develop interstitial lung disease from that treatment. And one of my junior faculty took that on as an area, and he has now not only figured out sort of what kinds of cells are involved with it, that very basic bench research, but he's also translated into what is the therapy if somebody develops this type of interstitial lung disease after getting an immune checkpoint inhibitor. What should you do to make them better? And I mean, this has all happened in the course of, less than 10 years. And so I see this research as being sort of the fundamental, which will change the way we take care of our patients and get to a point where we have much, much better outcomes for many different types of interstitial lung disease.
Thank you so much. This is also, I think this is really informative to our audience here, and I think it's just invaluable for them to hear from you about that experience. I'm going to turn my slides back on, and let's wrap up here with just a few more comments. Okay, about how the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation has actually interacted with the NIH to further pulmonary fibrosis research. The NIH is really uniquely positioned to convene stakeholders across the pulmonary fibrosis community to work together to drive forward progress. And these are some of the workshops and meetings that representatives from the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation have participated in with clinical researchers, basic science researchers, and we are able to then represent patients and the community to bring our experience of working with the community itself, as well as to elevate that patient voice. And sometimes that even means finding patient volunteers to speak at these meetings with these researchers, and keeping the patient that's living with pulmonary fibrosis really at the center of that research. The PFF has also supported extramural, outside of the NIH walls, research that has been funded by the NIH. So I've mentioned the Precision study. It is a multi-center clinical trial that the use of the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation's registry and input from the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation was really key to the approval of that grant to fund that study. And so it just tells you that this relationship with the NIH, between the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation and the NIH, is one of certainly of mutual respect, but understanding the importance of of what we are doing in the community. We also have a couple of other grants that we've worked with. These are two of them where medical team participants are on the advisory boards for those projects, looking at basic science mechanisms, as well as early pulmonary fibrosis, including family members that are at risk for pulmonary fibrosis, ways for early detection and potentially preventions. These are really important studies, and we're able to be involved with those and advise on them. We have also been privileged to have colleagues from the NIH speak at the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Summit. Dr. Jim Kiley was the former director of the Division of Lung Diseases. He spoke in 2017 about the future of genetics and precision medicine in the treatment of pulmonary fibrosis. But I want to call out that he also emphasized, and this is available on YouTube if you want to go listen to him, the importance of collaboration and deep partnerships across the PF community with patients, the NIH, researchers, clinicians. So certainly recognizing the importance of an all hands on deck approach. And in 2023, Matt Craig, who is a former branch chief in lung biology and disease, came to this summit and spoke about ongoing NIH funded research, and then also detailed for that audience many of the funding mechanisms available for the NIH to support pulmonary fibrosis research. We've mentioned several times the PFF Scholars Program. This is, again, early career. We fund a number of different types of research, basic, clinical, and so on. And it allows those young investigators to collect some of that preliminary data that will then allow them to put together a compelling proposal for further funding that will help them become a more independent researcher. And the return on investment for the PFF Scholars Program has just been overwhelming in terms of the number of dollars that have been provided to these young researchers, and then what they have been able to go on and accomplish in terms of grant funding for continued work and careers in pulmonary fibrosis. We also do legislative advocacy. I'm sure if you are on our mailing list, you've heard about our Hill Day activities. Our last Hill Day was in March, and we had many participants across the country meeting virtually with congressional offices about our legislative priorities, one of which includes funding, federal funding for pulmonary fibrosis research, both at the NIH, but also through the peer-reviewed medical research program at the Department of Defense. And this is really not advocating for any specific amount, but really advocating for the biggest slice of that pie that we're able to get funded for pulmonary fibrosis research, and making sure that those topics are included as Congress tells the NIH what they should be studying, because they make the budget, they give the priorities to the NIH, and the NIH has to figure out how to execute that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, because if you've tuned into the news at all, you know there are a lot of changes happening at the federal government level. And the NIH has had freezes to processes, freezes to funding provided both internally and externally, and then job cuts that have really impacted the normal operations necessary to conduct the research that we've been talking about today. So for those of you who don't remember your high school course in US Gov, again, Congress makes the budget, the federal budget. It includes the budgeting for the Health and Human Services, which includes the National Institutes of Health, and all that medical research that is funded there. And but in addition to funding freezes, loss of personnel, and canceled meetings, there's actually a proposal from the executive branch to the Congress that may cut the total size of the pie that I've been referring to, but the NIH budget by 40% next year, which means that even if we get the same percentage of the pie for pulmonary fibrosis research, that number could go down pretty dramatically. I'm going to remind you of this. That is, there's a lot of clinical research going on in pulmonary fibrosis right now, but if the preclinical research that we need for shots on goal can't happen, and we saw that the majority of that is funded by the National Institutes of Health at a degree that can't be replicated elsewhere. If that's disrupted, then we lose that part of the pipeline, and you can imagine what might happen to clinical therapeutic development in just a few years. So now maybe you're wondering, okay, this sounds concerning. What can I, just one person, or maybe you're watching with a family member there, what can I even do about this? It seems bigger than me. Advocacy is so important. And if you feel like this issue is important and want to get involved, you can become a PFF advocate. It's super easy. Our team has made it really easy to sign up for our advocacy alert emails. If you're not already getting those, you can sign up for those on our website. And those will let you know about what's happening and how you can get involved at specific points of time when we want to emphasize our priorities, which again are federal funding for pulmonary fibrosis research and the Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform Act, which we'll actually talk about more next week. There's an upcoming webinar about that specific topic. Right now, we are asking our community to call their members of Congress. You can also email them if you want to, but to ask them to protect the research funding at the National Institutes of Health, specifically for pulmonary fibrosis. You can share your story. You can talk about the importance of this. You can bring up any facts that we talked about today. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to give exact numbers. Just call, make your voice heard. The people that are elected in your community work for you, and they are there to listen and there to represent you. And I will tell you, I thought about actually, if we had time, just making a call in front of all of you guys to my senator's office, because it's always a good experience for me. The person who answers the phone is very kind. They take a note, they listen to what I have to say, and then they tell me who they're going to pass it on to in the health legislation portion of their office, and that will get to my senator or my congressman. But this is an easy way. I'm going to flip here. This is a website. You can scan this with your phone if you want to. We'll make sure that you guys get a link later. You can go to the website and find where to become a PFF advocate. But this is an easy way to get in touch. You can send a letter to the right person through this website. It will also help you with a script if you want to make a phone call, leave a message, and so on. So having done this, and I've done it multiple times, so we'll do it again, I can say it is easy. People are kind. They're not going to be ugly to you. And it takes less time than you think it would. All right, I'm going to invite Dr. Danoff to come back on the screen. and we will try to answer some questions. Let me check my time. Oh yeah, we're in good shape. I have a couple of questions about the SOAR Act that I want to go ahead and get out of the way, because that is not quite the focus of this talk today. The Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform Act, not to go into the details of it, but you can find more information on our website, has been reintroduced in this Congress. And so there is some momentum between the members of the Oxygen Coalition that we are a part of, organizations that are pushing for this legislative reform, to now go back and get additional co-sponsors, get it moved through a committee, and hopefully signed in this Congress. So just because it did not get signed into law last Congress, it has been reintroduced, and that process is underway. There is a webinar next week with a call-in day specific to the SOAR Act. If you are interested in that, we can make sure you get information about it. But that is, and then another question was, would the budget cuts at National Institutes of Health specifically impact the Supplemental Oxygen Access Reform Act? Probably not, just because they are part of separate organizations within Health and Human Services. So the SOAR Act is really targeting Medicare, so CMS, which is under a different part of Health and Human Services than the NIH. But cuts across Health and Human Services may have some impact on the totality of Medicare. We're not entirely sure how that might look, and things seem to be changing pretty often. It doesn't mean that the bill can't become a law, and it doesn't change our approach necessarily to advocating for it. Okay, I am gonna go to our questions here, and okay. Now, Dr. Danoff, can you, I know this is an evolving issue, and we have a question about what's required within the NIH, how much has actually been lost in terms of positions reduced, and let's not talk quite about frozen funding yet, but mostly about positions reduced, and then also potentially budget cuts to the NIH. Are we seeing impacts from that at this point? And how short are they, and what's needed?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And what I would say, Dr. Case, is that this is changing practically on a daily basis. The first group of people who lost their jobs were people who were what were called provisional employees, which were people in their first year. But some of those people were people who had worked with, the NIH in different roles and had just changed to a new position, or maybe somebody who was a contractor who'd been a long-term contractor who came in as a government employee. So that was a pretty substantial loss of people who keep the wheels of the NIH running. And many people will have seen that now there is this concept of the reduction in workforce, or RIF. The RIF is removing people from every single branch of the NIH. We've seen a lot of impact on what we call the extramural side of the NIH, which is the part which is involved with grants management. So the ability to actually submit grants, to have the grant reviewed, to then get that grant that is approved for funding, to actually get to that point and actually have the funding distributed. All of those pieces have been either slowed or stopped, depending on exactly which area you were involved in, which institute it was involved with. But these are really critical things. And I suppose I should have said this just very directly, which is there are a lot of people who are very early in their career who will not have a job if their grants are not reviewed. There will be no place for them. They will go and do something else. Maybe they'll go into private practice, which is a very important field, but they won't go into research. And so we have a lot of our pipeline at risk right now because of this impact on the extramural side. On the intramural side, it's also taken a lot of people have either taken early retirements. We've lost a lot of people who had a huge amount of knowledge. We've had the loss of, I believe at this point in time, we've lost 7 of the directors of institutes. And again, with that is a lot of institutional knowledge that gets lost. So it's had a very dramatic effect, and it's being felt already, and it's being felt by both the intramural and the extramural side, and all of the people who are applying to get grants are really feeling it right now.
Talk a little bit about, I know some of the answers to this, but talk a little bit for our audience about some of the differences in approach that some of our CCNs are experiencing in response to these things,
Yeah.
in terms of being able to continue the research in the first place, um, hiring of coordinators and support personnel at their institutions, um, having investigators actually be able to travel to meetings to be able to share their results or get input from others and further the research that way. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacted? I mean, I know again, developing, and we're not quite sure how things are even going to look a week, a month, 6 months from now. But what are we seeing at this point?
Right. No, thank you, Dr. Case. And I think that's really important because, what we're seeing is that, I'll just give a couple examples, is that clinical trials that have been ongoing, there for every clinical trial, there is something called an IRB, which is an institutional review board that essentially makes sure that a trial will be ethical and safe for the patients. So part of the funding cut that just occurred is that the institutional review board, which supports 1,300 institutions, including several that are doing clinical trials in pulmonary fibrosis, their funding just got cut. So essentially 1,300 institutions who are running clinical trials with them have the potential of having to stop their trials because the IRB doesn't exist at this moment in time. It was essentially lost all its funding. And some institutions now, because of the uncertainty related to funding from the NIH, have actually told their faculty members that they cannot go to meetings. So they can't travel to go to another meeting to give a talk or to learn new things. So that's obviously having a big impact. We also know that members of the NIH who, as you pointed out, we've had NIH members come to our PFF summit to really educate us and teach us about how things work. They're also not allowed to travel right now. So it's really having this very pervasive impact at many levels, both in the care of our patients, in clinical trials, in research, in sharing of knowledge, all of which have had, unfortunately, I think are having a detrimental effect on the ability to have pulmonary fibrosis research and care improve over time.
Thank you for that answer. Before I ask this next question, I'm actually going to flip back to, no, I'm not. There we go. I'm going to flip back so people can see the URL and the QR code there if they want to sign up to be a PFF advocate and get in touch with their members of Congress. I do have a question. I'm going to ask a little bit different question about how it was asked, but how is it that the leadership at the NIH decides what their priorities are for, let's say, for pulmonary fibrosis, and within pulmonary fibrosis? How do they make those decisions?
Right. No, that's a great question. And historically, there have been several ways inputs. So there is some congressional input, that is, Congress says, we really think that it's important to understand what causes cancer, and therefore we encourage you to study cancer. And, there are those congressionally mandated questions. But for the most part, each institute has a group of experts who sit together and say, what are the most fundamental pieces of information that are necessary in order to move this field forward? And there might be a request for applications in those areas. And then all of the remainder is actually generated by researchers who are in the field, who maybe are doctors like you and me who work with patients who have pulmonary fibrosis. And we say, this is something we think would be really important in order to give better care, or this is something we don't understand. And if we understood it, we would have a better idea of who's going to develop pulmonary fibrosis. And those are the proposals that go into the NIH, the grant proposals that get reviewed, that then get funded. So for the most part, the majority of the research funding goes to those investigator-initiated studies, the ones that come from people working in the field, and then a smaller portion come from requests for application that are from the NIH, where they say, for instance, there was an RFA on oxygen delivery devices. And so that was something that came from the NIH, but it was based actually on a meeting that the NIH had with patient advocates who said, oxygen's a big problem. We need better oxygen equipment. And therefore, the NIH put out a request for application in oxygen.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions. Thank you, everyone who's listened today and been and had such great questions to answer. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone. We are out of time. But I do want to thank again, there we go. Thank again, Dr. Danoff, for joining me today. Thank you all for listening. Know that we will be posting the recording for this session within hopefully a few days to a week or two. We'll notify you when that comes out. And again, if you can and feel led to do so, please reach out to your elected officials. This is an important issue for all of our community. And hopefully we've done a little bit better job to connect the dots for you today about the relevance and importance of some of those things that may seem a little esoteric. If you could, please stay with us for just a moment more to give us your feedback, and we will see you again at our next webinar. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.